Thank you very much for joining Dubai Expo session. My name is Dr. Sandra Pisik, and it's to chair today's session called Democratization, Living the Change in a Post-Pandemic World. Unfortunately, pandemic battle, it is not over. We are entering the first of the COVID-19 pandemic, battling the emerging variants, including Omicron. We are confronted with something invisible for human eyes, that nature took the advantage of technology because the global connectivity spread the virus across the world. Yet it is through technology and human ingenuity that biotech companies were able to vaccines quickly, bringing the issue of vaccine equity to the forefront. We also know that around 3 billion people, many of them in Africa, have yet to receive a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine. Vaccination rate in the poorest 52 countries is only 6%, despite the fact that we are living in the fourth industrial revolution, which theoretically could bridge this divide. There are many similarities between climate and COVID-19 pandemic. Both are transboundary, both are affecting all of us, and both share inability to act and decisively on the evidence of science. To discuss these changes that needs to happen in the post-pandemic world in a context of equity, I'm joined by 6 exceptional speakers from 6 countries. Fortunately, Dr. Josef Nassef of UNFCCC could not be with us today. His apologies, and we are going to be joined by Ms. Marcela Main-Sancha of UAE. And in addition, I would be delighted to welcome with us today Mr. Paul UBS from London, United Kingdom, Dr. Nibal Ibdeli from joining us from Beirut, from Lebanon, Mr. Guiliano Reto of CEPRO joining us all the way from Brazil, Ms. Mariam Al-Foudery and Dr. Zitouni Kualada of FAO Rome in Italy. I would like to introduce Ms. Marcela Main-Sancha of the United Nations Climate Change, UNFCCC, a Chilean lawyer specialized in law, worked for 10 years for the United Nations, currently project manager of Resilience Frontiers, and the title of the entry is Digital Technologies. Marcela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra, for your kind words, and through you, thank you also to G-STIC for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. The SDGs are known as a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable world for all. Climate change is not only represented in SDG 13. Climate change is an existential risk that manifests across the board in all SDGs. Climate change is an existential risk to humanity as a whole. And yet, climate change is not the same for everybody. Climate change is, by default, inequitable. Inequitable in terms of the distribution of the impacts. The degree of vulnerability of our communities differ quite a lot among them. Inequitable in terms of the capacity of the different communities to adapt, and inequitable in terms of the capacity of different economic communities to take action to mitigate emissions. These inequities arise from various and very complex factors that could be encapsulated in economic and developmental disparities, which is exactly what the SDGs are trying to address. However, while we put our efforts in progressing the SDGs, and we are solving problems that were identified in 2015 already, time flies, the world will not stop. It will continue changing, whether environmentally, economically, socially, and even technologically, maybe mostly technologically. Let's imagine the world in 2030. Let's imagine the 2030 scenario even in a situation where the SDGs have been fully achieved. We will have, nevertheless, the impact of impending ecological risk, climate change, ecosystems degradation. Let's continue imagining the scenario in the 2013. Again, even with the SDGs having been fully achieved. The paradigm shifts that are introduced by technologies, and we can think from artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain, biotechnology, smart homes, etc. All these para-SDGs developments beyond the fulfillment of the SDGs, all of these will present us with new challenges. With regards to technology, the systemic and regulatory environment that will give direction to the use, the deployment, the coverage, and equally important, who benefits from it, will be instrumental in determining whether these new technologies will exacerbate inequalities or could actually reduce such inequalities. For now, this direction is mainly determined by the motivation and interests of a few. Such interests may work against the well-being of poor communities, or the rights today recognized to citizens. New technologies, like, not so new, we're using them, but the newer technologies like cryptocurrencies, blockchain, today are energy-intensive tools. As such, not quite climate-friendly. Breaches of privacy and threats to democracy should not be overlooked. We may well end up in this scenario post-SDGs having to go back to the drawing board and devise new goals to fix new disparities of well-being created by ourselves. Now, we can also change that scenario. We can incentivize the direction of developing and applying solutions toward creating universal well-being for all. The technologies for both mitigation and adaptation are there, and they are getting better and better. What may still need some refinement is our policy environment, especially those that could help break down barriers and boundaries for global well-being. For example, addressing enhanced access to technology would open it up to communities who could be able to develop local solutions. Another example, addressing the interlink between access to technology and access to information could result in scaling up the access to information by the public. Our policy environment would also need to address challenges and barriers, capacity needs, education, digital literacy, etc. We will hear today from our speakers about their attempts to do so, from the different perspectives ranging from the global commons to individual thematics areas to cutting-edge methodological approaches. We have been challenged by the science to alter our course in the next few years. And it is incumbent on us to do so in unison, holistically, and in a way that preempts the paradigm shifts that are upon us in these coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcela, for reminding us issues of climate change, equity, universal well-being. It is a great pleasure to introduce introduce our next speaker, Mr. Paul Donovan of UBS Global Wealth Management, Managing Director and Chief Economist, joining us on London, despite the difference, and the title of the tyrannical technology or digital democratization. Mr. Donovan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I think we have to recognize that the structural changes of the fourth industrial revolution have been accelerated by the pandemic. Things that were expected to take several years are now approaching more rapidly. Changes like working from home, online retail, for example, have happened a lot more quickly. The issue here is that a lot of the changes of the fourth industrial revolution are likely to increase efficiency in the global economy. And that is efficiency in an economic sense and also in an environmental sense, because in many ways, if we become more economically efficient, we will also be using fewer resources to achieve a rising standard of living. The challenge in this environment, I believe, is that technology is not actually that important to achieving the efficiency. It's not the technology that matters, it's how we use the technology that creates the efficiency. After all, in the first industrial revolution, whilst the steam engine was hailed as new technology, it had been invented 1600 years earlier. What was new in the 1700s was the fact that the steam engine was being used differently. What this means is the really important characteristic of the next 15 or 20 years is not how many microchips there are in your smartphone, but the people that are using the technology in order to generate efficiency. And that means that we need to get the right person in the right job at the right time. However, technology has the potential to undermine that process by creating prejudice, but it also has the potential to promote that process by fighting prejudice. Technology has a negative and a positive aspect at the same time. If we look at the tyrannical technology, the negative aspects of technology, these, I think, are relatively obvious and well known. David Duke, the extreme far-right US politician, in rallying troops in a podcast broadcast over an extreme white supremacist website, declared, now we have a tool, the internet. Because through connecting worldwide, the internet, social media, has been able to bring together isolated and extremely prejudiced individuals into a coherent group. Bringing together prejudiced individuals obviously increases their power and undermines the diversity and inclusion that will promote the efficiency of technology over the next 20 years. There are, I think, two aspects of technology that are particularly relevant here in the promotion of prejudice. The first is that much social media allows for anonymous comment. The individual can hide behind a pseudonym. You don't know who it is who is trolling you on social media. And because the individual feels that their identity is hidden, their inhibitions, the social norms come down, and they become more violent, more aggressive in their attacks because they feel that there will be no consequences from being extremely prejudiced online. The second thing is that the use of technology in terms of communication allows us to dehumanize the individual that we are attacking. And that is a critical part of prejudice, generally speaking. Because you are not face to face with somebody, you are not seeing the human reactions, the response to the prejudicial attacks. You are able to think of the person or the group that you are attacking as somehow not being human. And that is the very first step in any form of prejudice. And it can lead to terrible consequences, as we have seen throughout history. Prejudice is also fueled by the spreading of fake news. And we know that technology today allows us to spread fake news faster and to share that news with a wider group of people than ever before. And in fact, fake news is spread faster and wider than the truth. And the reason for this is very obvious. Fake news is entertaining because you can make fake news as interesting as you like because you don't need to have the truth there. You're freed to try and attract as many in the audience as possible. We also have an echo chamber coming through, repeating views back, algorithms that are promoting prejudice discreetly. There have been accusations, for example, of YouTube and TikTok promoting homophobia through their algorithms in the past. In other words, technology finds new ways to be prejudiced and thus to undermine the efficiency we need in the economy. But we shouldn't be too pessimistic. There are ways of fighting back. The use of technology removes barriers and it allows more people to participate in the economy than before. The gatekeepers that used to keep people out are disappearing. Through crowdfunding, through online video, through online music, minority voices can start to be heard. We can showcase possibilities, provide role models to minority groups, allowing them to develop, to progress, and to see the opportunities that are available. Just as the extremists and the prejudiced can build online communities, so too can the targets of prejudice. And we can find disparate communities coming together, which can be extraordinarily important, especially where those communities are spread evenly through society. Sexuality minorities, for example, are about 10% of any country's population, and yet they are spread throughout society. Through an online community, they can come together and find support. We can also see an increase in understanding of others' positions. Minority groups can interact with the majority group more and more on social media, and through parasocial contact, people learn about and understand the positions of other groups. And finally, the technology can allow minority groups to come together to organize economic protest. Taking this all together, I think that there are opportunities to use technology to fight prejudice, to make sure we have the right person in the right job at the right time, to promote efficiency, and through that, to start tackling the bigger problems of climate change in the global economy. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Donovan, for a reminder on ethical use of technology. I'm very interested in your comments on efficiencies, on the technology for more efficient economic development is very interesting, and in fighting inequalities. So technology abilities, which takes me to the next speaker, which is Dr. Foudery of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, Chief of Innovation, joining us all the way from Lebanon. And Dr. Foudery is going to speak on combating the digital divide to build. Dr. Foudery, the floor or the screen is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me in this panel. Let us go directly to the slides, please. Then my contribution will be about how combating digital divide that exists, in fact, unfortunately, in many countries and in many regions around the globe. We know, as speakers say, that today the digital technology is crucial for our social and economic development, and it has been shown during COVID that digital technology plays very important role for maintaining continuity of business, continuity of employment, continuity of education, and also for the provision of citizen services. In addition to that, of course, we can mention that it was also important for entertainment and socializing. However, technology gap appears very much during this pandemic, and it was demonstrated that digital divide really should be bridged at all levels. And digital divide, by the way, it has many aspects. As mentioned, there are this accessibility, and there is accessibility to digital devices, but also divide in skills and knowledge about how to use the technology, as well as content and applications available around the world. But just to give you a hint about the digital divide that exists in terms of accessibility and affordability around the world, just some information that some statistics from the ITU about the divide currently. Although the spread of technology has been, and digital technology specifically was really spread very well during the last year, and we see a lot of progress in digital, bridging digital divide in terms of accessibility, at least. However, there is still divided, and here in the left side we can see the spread of internet among regions in the world, and we can see that the percentage, the average today of the availability of internet, or the population connected to internet, is 63%, which increased from 57% last year in 2019. And this is really huge difference in 1 year. However, we can see that there is gap between the different regions, and it is very much demonstrated in Africa and in some area in Asia as well. Then there is digital divide, which is really very huge between developed and developing countries, or least developed country, where the difference of accessibility is really huge. The digital divide also exists among countries, among regions, as well as within the country. For example, between rural and urban area, there is a huge differences in the globe, as well as between social group. For example, between men and women, the percentage is really, there is a gap between the accessibility of men and women, and also among youth and elderly people. Among the youth, the percentage is today about 71%. However, as elderly people or more aged people, it's 57% the penetration rate of the internet. This is said that, but we have to admit also that there is also differences and gap in the countries in terms of affordability and of the quality of the internet, which is demonstrated by having a good broadband, and this was very important during the pandemic because we relied very much on internet for all our activity. And here we see that in developed country, the broadband progress was really very quite good, in good shape. However, in developed country, here we can see that there is, a huge difference in the terms of quality of internet and the quality of a broadband. Therefore, there is a lot to do in terms of accessibility, even and if we don't speak about other divided, which are which are in terms of digital skills, in content, and in the meaningful use of the internet. And here I relied on the previous speaker who demonstrated very well that how we use the technology is very important. And in terms of digital skill content, it is in the local language or in the relevant content to people. It's also very important and for bridging the digital divide. Just to move ahead in the presentation, then what is needed is really to have digital equity and to bridge in order to have accessibility to all at all level of in terms of content, as well as good quality content, good quality access. Digital equity, in fact, it is defined as to ensure that all individual and community have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in the technology age, and to have the full participation in economic life, in political life, and in all aspects of life. In order to ensure the digital equity, there is digital inclusion literature give us some roadmap how to reach this digital equity by having affordable, robust broadband internet services for all as much as possible, to have internet-enabled device for all users, for all people, even disabled people, and also to have successful digital literacy, among the groups, different age of different social group, and also to have, develop appropriate application, appropriate algorithm for that encompass everybody. This is really very much needed, and what we can say that there are many trials in this regard to have digital inclusion. And if I mention one of them, we can say that in the lately published UNSG roadmap for digital cooperation, he dedicated specific attention to the build of an inclusive digital economy and society. And it was he gave some the most important aspect globally that we enable us to achieve this digital equity. For example, as I mentioned earlier, to have a kind of high-speed broadband connection to all, having the right application to all. And I will stop here for other speakers. Thank you.
I am fascinated by the concept of digital equity, which I think is hugely important. And thank you for highlighting that this digital equity still needs to be achieved between developed countries and least developed countries, rural, urban areas, as well as different social groups. I'm delighted to take the discussion, a case study from Brazil, particularly Brazilian government. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Guiliano Barreto of CEPRO, the largest information technology company providing public sector. The title of the intervention is The Digital Transformation of Brazil.br. And Mr. Barreto, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, first of all. I'd like to present to you a 3-year job in 5 minutes, mostly. Good morning again to everyone and to our speakers. Well, as a background, Brazilian citizens are people connected to the internet through cell phones. Brazil ended 2020 with 234 million mobile access for a population of 210 million people. One of President Bolsonaro's campaign commitments was to reduce the burden of the government on the citizens. And one of the first guidances adopted was to digitize as many public services as we could. Well, to achieve the full potential of digital transformation, a secretariat dedicated to digital government was created, directly linked to the Ministry of Economy. CEPRO is a Brazilian state-owned company supervised by this secretariat. We have first created a platform as a first step to the evolution to the concept of government as a platform. We created a single access through the interoperability of government databases and data conference through face validation. At the same time, we have incorporated more than 1,000 websites and all its public services from public agencies. We also regulated security levels for each services to democratize access by the people as much as we could. Then we have made available 4,900 public services to the people, 73% of which are completely digital. We climbed from 1,700,000 Brazilians in January 2019 to 119 million people in December 21. Our strategy to do it was to scale, providing as much services as possible through the offering, not waiting for their demand, for the demand from the citizens. We did move the axis of power from the state bureaucracy to the people. And we adopted technology, the best technology available at a low cost. As examples, government design system, real-time indexing, AI-based recommendation systems, biometric liveness detection, and privacy by design and by default, observing the Brazilian GDPR rules. As a main legal framework, it was necessary, and we accounted with presidential support by decrees, and National Congress support by approving some specific laws, not huge laws, but some specific changes in the actual legislation. Well, we can give to you some examples of available services. Regarding the public health system, we provided national vaccination card. We provided national COVID-19 vaccination certificates. We made available to the people the follow-up of blood tests and donation records. In the pandemic, we support the people. People outside the banking system could easily create 30 million banking accounts to receive emergency aid. 100 million Brazilians receive government help to get through the pandemic within 30 days. About mobility, all Brazilians now have access to driver's license through digital means, but we also made available automobiles registration documents and made it possible to transfer its ownership by digital means. Brazil didn't stop in the pandemic period. As for the social security system, once we now have 120 million biometric records, it was possible to meet the end of 35 million people for the proof of life through digital means that made them possible to receive new pensions, and we avoided frauds while public offices were closer to the people. Finally, several public documents now can be signed electronically, police reports are completely digital, and work permits have also moved from physical to digital media. Thank you very much for all. I'm here for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barreto. I think this is actually a fascinating example of digital accessibility through variety of public sectors in public life, such as health, transportation, and security. Congratulations to SEPRA for facilitating this. I'm sure many lessons could be learned for other regions and other countries. Self-sustainability in supply chains came apparent during COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm delighted to introduce Al-Foudery, which is a Chief Marketing Officer of Agility, an organization which is leading provider in supply chain services investment. Title of the entry is Digital Tools Leveraging the Playing Field for Business. Ms. Al-Foudery, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So, as we all know, the pandemic was a health crisis, an economic crisis, and also a supply chain crisis. The level of the supply chain disruption that we've seen over the last 2 years has been completely without precedent in our lifetimes. And when we think about the future, we can imagine that the age of supply chain crisis and disruption is not over, as you know, extreme climate events and other global issues begin to heat up, if you'll forgive the pun. The supply chain is going to continue to be top of mind for businesses of all sizes everywhere. So I thought today I would talk to you a little bit as from the perspective of a supply chain company and a supply chain investor, and some of the ideas that we're thinking about when we think about sustainability and sustainable supply chains and inclusive supply chains. So very quickly, just so you understand this, the business, Agility has one part of the business is where we operate a number of subsidiary businesses in the supply chain space, and we're also a large investor in the supply chain space. We're a shareholder, the second largest shareholder in the world's third largest logistics company, as well as we have an active ventures arm investing in the technologies of the future. And this is very important because we're going to be talking a little bit about what those technologies of the future look like. We ourselves within our business have a fairly, robust sustainability strategy and record. But this is really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about two areas. I want to talk about how Agility is thinking about digital logistics to empower small and medium-sized businesses and make them part of the global economy and part of the global e-economy in particular, and how we think about driving inclusivity in supply chains. So on the first topic, I think one of the things that has been really interesting is, despite the fact that SMEs account for the sort of biggest share of job creation around the world, the reality is that they have been historically marginalized, if you like, when it comes to cross-border trade. So they account for 2/3 of all the jobs and less than 1/3 of the world's exports. And this is true across both developed and emerging markets. So one of the big changes that we've seen, especially over the last 2 years because of the pandemic, has been, of course, this digital acceleration. And with the digital acceleration, we've seen a massive sort of tidal wave jump in e-commerce. So, e-commerce is now 10 times, has grown 10 times as much over the course of the pandemic as it has over the last 10 years combined. So world over, even in emerging markets, we're seeing a lot of forays and growth in the e-commerce space. And what's really interesting is that we find that small businesses that are not only connected to the internet, but that are digital businesses, are actually significantly more likely to trade across borders. So it seems that, and historically, cross-border trade has been one of the paths of prosperity. I mean, global trade has been linked to rising income levels world over the course of the last 3 decades, not just the last couple of years. So, the idea that because of e-commerce, small businesses would have the opportunity to participate in the global economy at higher rates is actually a very exciting one. But to do that, e-commerce, small businesses are going to need the digital tools in order to compete, not just the marketplaces, not just the sort of the big, not just where to sell, but also how to manage the logistics infrastructure, how to get access to financing, and so on. And there are many companies, Agility is one of them, that are investing heavily in building this enabling ecosystem for small businesses to trade. So in other words, empowering SMEs to trade online. And what we've developed is we have a commercial platform called Shippa that helps small businesses trade online. But it's really interesting because this is the kind of activity that I think we can think about commercially for commercial reasons that have significant impact from an inclusion and digital skills building and digital enablement perspective as well. And then I said that we're also ventures investors, and on that note, one of the things that Agility has been doing increasingly over the last 5 years is investing in the ESG space. And again, we're investing for 2 reasons. One, because we believe that these are the businesses that are going to help define the future. They're going to help us future-proof our own business. And also because we're heavily invested in the sustainability space. And, we believe that it's not only relevant, but that it's necessary. And so we've invested in a number of different companies, but I think there are a couple that I just want to focus on because I find them really interesting. So for example, this idea of technology equity. How do we make sure that we broaden access for people using technology. And one of the things that I found really fascinating in looking at some of the technology companies that we invest in is that it's not always about reinventing the wheel. Sometimes it's about better use of data and better use of assets to more efficiently use things that we already have. And I'll give you one example. There's a really interesting digital freight matching platform based out of Brazil called Fret.com, and it's the second largest digital logistics platform in the world. And what it does is it tackles the idea most trucks empty on the way back. So they go to their destination and on the way back they travel empty. And something like 30% of all global emissions from trucking come from these empty backhaul trucks. And this digital freight platform, which is based in Brazil but works across Latin America, says, okay, and we know that most of these truckers are mom and pop truckers. They're not part of big trucking conglomerates. They're, a family that owns one truck or two trucks. So how can we make sure that they don't travel empty? So basically, it matches. It's like Uber for trucking. It matches people that have trucking needs with trucks based actually on the road, based on their geolocation, and helps get these trucks filled. Is it environmental technology? No, it's not an environmental technology, but does it have an environmental impact? Absolutely, a environmental impact, and a huge economic and social impact as well, because you're actually creating not only better service for customers, but also you're improving the livelihoods of these small trucking businesses that have these trucks on the road. That's one example. And another example that I find really interesting is, again, not an environmental technology per se, but it's a shared mobility platform that Agility has invested in. And basically what it does is it looks at the issue of transportation in emerging markets. And it says, who doesn't always travel safely on public transportation? And it's not always to travel on public transportation. It's not always convenient. It's not always safe. There are lots of issues. So this company called Swivel basically takes existing infrastructure. So they take, vans and buses that are used for tourist means and other means and puts them on transportation routes and allows both men and women to book their seats and have a reserved place on basically a public, quasi-public transport vehicle. So it becomes very affordable, more affordable than a private car. And, people can text out their van number, etc. So it also becomes a safer ride. So I think these are some examples of really interesting sort of future-facing technologies that are also more inclusive in their approach and using data and existing assets to be more inclusive in their approach. And of course, Agility is invested in the sustainable trucking space and electrification phase with companies like Hyliion and Volta, etc. And if in the questions we want to discuss that, we can. And basically, I'll just close on this note. Essentially, if you look at the big picture of technology, as climate change in particular, if you look at research from the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, there's great news. 65% emissions addressed with technologies that either exist or that are in early stages of adoption. So actually, yes, there's still, innovation that needs to occur, but a big chunk of current emissions can be addressed with current technology. But there's also bad news. Bad news is that most of the businesses in the world are actually small and medium-sized enterprises, and they're not always fit to take on, use all of these new technologies. There's another piece of research from HSBC, which is really fascinating, which talks about the sort of financing deficit for SMEs to adapt climate change technologies being in the tune of $50 trillion. So I think as we go forward, it'll be really important to sort of keep these twin ideas in mind. How do we not only think about technologies and broadening access to technologies, but also making sure that the small and medium-sized enterprises of the world have the ability to adopt those technologies, the skills, the financing, and the incentives to really adopt that technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Al-Foudery. I think it's very interesting concept of inclusivity, supply chains, and I think you touched on important issues of efficiency in economy, which our second speaker touched upon, as well as context of technology and climate change, which brings me to our last speaker, Dr. Zitouni Kwal-Ada, a Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Change, and Environment at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, in Rome. Dr. Zitouni is going to speak about harnessing the power of innovation from nature and people. And I think that the nature is the very important in the dialogue on technology and people. Dr. Kualada, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sandra, and good morning to all the panelists and everyone joining us online. It's my pleasure to join this event. Yes, let me start with a couple of facts with where we are with the pandemic. There are two things actually that the pandemic has revealed to us. First is our vulnerability, and second, the pandemic has also reinforced the need to focus on resilience. Because unfortunately, not only were we vulnerable, but we were not resilient either. And we have seen how the pandemic has reshaped the way we work, the way we shop, we communicate, we go to school, and this happened across the world. And it has also revealed the importance really of bridging the digital divide that many colleagues have spoken about, particularly for those people around the world, the 3.6 billion people or so who remain offline. And if I give you an example of the impact of this and how some parts of the society are affected, if we look at the closure of schools, for instance, this has illustrated really the digital divide and the equity, and the impact also on health and nutrition. So if we see what's been happening in the global north, where it has been inconvenient, obviously, for parents and for students and children not to go to school, and this has an educational setback, obviously, for students and children. But it's not really a vital threat, if you like. And then when we compare this to the global south, in many cases, closing schools means no more school meals. So you can see the impact in different parts of the world and what it means in different settings and in different circumstances. And this is, again, illustrates the equity that has been touched on. Now, climate change, obviously, we know that is already affecting people and ecosystems and livelihoods, across the globe. We've been talking about innovation and digitalizations. These are priorities for FAO. But the digital transformation of agriculture, for instance, not only it is important, but it does require the establishment of some enabling conditions to facilitate the use of digital technology. And these include the availability, the connectivity, the affordability, as well as having policies and programs in place that can facilitate that. So on one hand, it is an opportunity to harness the power of innovation, to make sustainable agri-food systems central to tackling climate change, the climate change crisis, the food insecurity, and the biodiversity loss. And on the other hand, it is also a challenge, as it's been said, because the challenge is to get everyone to benefit from the access to digital technology. For example, there are around 500 million smallholder farmers around the world. And obviously, we need to help smallholder farmers to have access to renewable technology so they can access water, store food, and medicine, etc. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, it is estimated that 20 to 40% of crop production is lost because of poor processing and storage. So the pandemic has shown the independence and the interconnection of our world. Everything is interconnected and everything is affected. And this is very well reflected in the SDGs. We see the linkages between the climate, the food, the water, the energy, and also the linkages between poverty, hunger, and health. And there are many aspects in this interconnection that we underestimate, that we are unaware of, and yet they're critical to how the world functions. Just take the example of pollinators. 1/3 of global food production relies on pollinators like bees and insects, butterflies, birds, and others. So interconnection and one system approach, it is important. It reminds us of the fact that we need to look at things in a synergistic way and make sure that we address the trade-offs. So we don't try to fix one problem here and create another problem somewhere else. So we have to make sure that we look at things together, break the silos across teams, across disciplines, across institutions. So this is the interconnection, if you like. Now, the last point I want to make is with regard to, even though obviously we have one world, ecosystems are interconnected, but there are also differences, obviously. Differences across the board, differences in our capacities, differences in the local conditions, in our ambitions, in the actions we're taking to tackle these crises. And there are differences in our understanding of the world and how things are interconnected, and differences in how things are impacted on people in different parts of the world, and differences in how we respond to these impacts and how we adapt as well. So just to conclude, the point I want to make here is the importance of interdependence, equity, and also resilience. Thanks, Sandra. Back to you.
So, Zitouni, as always, I very much value your one ecosystem approach, and thank you for reminding us that the pandemic exposed vulnerability in us as well as resilience. And food production is actually critical to our future ability. We have still some time. I would like to open to a few questions, and I would like to ask each speaker and request a brief answer if I may. We'll do that in the order of presentation. So this question will be to Marcela Main-Sancha, listening to the science. So from the perspective of climate change, Alan, that you would recommend in fighting COVID-19 pandemic?
Interesting question, Sandra. Do you hear me?
Yes,
Interesting
we do.
question.
Thank you.
What I would say is that the lesson, or the reminder actually, it is that we cannot tackle neither climate change or the pandemic if we don't have a full systemic, holistic approach to understand the problem and to the solution, so that we don't create unforeseen additional problems, right? And this has been mentioned before when we are talking about the impacts of the pandemic, but it applies also to climate change and vice versa. We will not be able to understand the situation, to understand climate change or the pandemic, if we don't look at all the factors, very complex. And we won't be able to fully address the situation if we don't look at all the implications. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My next question of post-COVID economic research, I'd like to address to Mr. Donovan of UBS. What are the dynamics of green and social economy that could help post-COVID-19 future?
I think that the positives are that there has been a greater acceptance of the role of government in the economy as a result of the pandemic. This was an instance where government needed to play a role in order to ensure social equity and to stabilize the economy. And I think that that precedent may help with climate change, a greater acceptance that that government has to play a role here, and that is the positive. I think the negative aspect that we have is that the accelerated nature of structural change increases the disruption that individuals feel. People will lose income, they will lose social status as a result of this structural change, and that perhaps makes the prejudice concerns more significant. So the precedent of a greater role for government, I think, is our positive outcome from COVID as far as the post-pandemic world is concerned. The negative is a more accelerated pace of structural change does bring with it some socio-political risks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. The next question is to Dr. Nibal Ibdelli on shifting priorities. COVID-19 as an amplifier for pre-existing conditions, including a digital divide. What are the shifting priorities to address in the long-term future?
I believe the shifting priority, they are, I mean, in a way, I mentioned some of them during my presentation, but I mean, let me say that accessibility to the internet, to high, good quality internet is really a must. And that should be affordable for all class or social group. And this is really, we need to have a kind of metrics to say that what is the minimum required for having high quality internet for all, and to have affordability. Benchmarking is very important at a global level. And I believe there are some works that are being done in this regard. Then shifting so priority could include the digitalization in many sectors, digitalization of in terms of government services, in terms of learning process, I mean, and especially for education, e-education or e-learning, as well as for SMEs, as mentioned by our speaker. I mean that digitization of SMEs is very instrumental during for the future, as well as any social action. Another important, very important, is to have digital skills, but not only for accessibility to internet and so on, but to master selected emerging technology like AI, like Internet of Things, or even big data, how to use data and the data in general. Then these are maybe the most important shifts that I think for digital divide that should be included and embedded. And what is important to mention at this stage is to include this shift within development strategy, not only for ICT strategy or digital technology strategy, but even in development strategy of member states across the globe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A question is to Mr. Barreto of CEPRO on the context of decentralization and regionalization. Hyperglobalization is no longer tenable. What is the role of technology in decentralization and regionalization? The next question is to Ms. Al-Foudery on self-sufficient supply. So self-sufficiency brings sustainable localization. Would you address ecological renewal through digital supply chains? Fried kindly mention.
Hi, Sandra. Thank you. I think when we think about supply chains of the future, we need to think about the impact of supply chains. So today, the logistics and transportation industry is a heavily carbon-intensive industry. And that's just the fact. It's a major contributor to global emissions. And when we think about supply chains of the future, we're going to need to think about how that can change, how energy transformation in the supply chain industry is going to change. And it's not a totally straightforward proposition, especially for emerging markets. And I'll just give you one example. Let's look at the push towards electric vehicles, for example. This push towards electric vehicles is also rightfully moving into the trucking industry as well, which is great. However, the entire ecosystem needs to change in order for that supply chain to be truly green. You can't have an electric truck and a brown electricity grid and, call that a green supply chain. So I think one of the really interesting implications of a decarbonized supply chain is the number of different actors that will have to work together across both companies and governments in order to create an environment that will facilitate true systemic change. And I can tell you from our experience in both emerging markets and developed economies, that's not going to be easy. And although some of these conversations have started, in many markets, they're still in very early phases. And that doesn't correspond with the reality of needing to work very quickly to address some of these climate change issues. So I would say one of the most critical priorities is not just the technology itself or the adoption of the technology, but also the forums in which to talk about the connections between things, between different types of sectors, between different types of companies, and different types of policies that need to be implemented in order to make fast change tenable.
Thank you very much. And my last question is Zitouni. On long-term transformations, what are the key long-term transformations that the world needs to achieve to avoid a social catastrophe?
Thank you, Sandra, for the question. Yes, the transformation is absolutely needed because we have been having so many wake-up calls, so much evidence from the scientists and others, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPBES, and other experts. And the transformation needed is to reflect the fact that we cannot go back to business as usual. We have to look at how we use natural resources, how we live our lives in terms of behaviors, and how it affects the planet, how it affects people around us, and how it affects ourselves as well in terms of our health. So to achieve that transformation, we spoke about the importance of innovation and digitalization and equity. I add also the importance, obviously, of inclusion, which must be at the heart of our response and the solutions that we put in place if we really want to end hunger and end poverty and bridge the gap also between some issues that we have that are across the board to do with the gaps between hunger, for instance, and obesity and access to energy. And also the fact that we need to invest more. We need to invest more in innovative solutions, but also in other solutions such as nature-based solutions. And we saw at COP26 how adaptation was given much more importance. And it's really right now that we are giving that importance to adaptation, because tackling climate change is not only about mitigation, it's about adaptation. It's more about adaptation now. And the other thing I would say also is we need to fix this double crisis of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And another thing we need to make sure to do to ensure this transformation is to join the dots between these challenges and the processes that we have in place. Join the dots between tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and the point I made earlier about addressing synergies and trade-offs. And the last point I want to make is with regard to individuals, us. So it's not only about putting policies in place and looking at the technology. We have to take responsibility as well and think more about the choices we make and how our choices matter. They do matter on how that affects the environment and affects our health. So we need to involve more, inform more, empower more, including those people who are really left behind, like smallholder farmers and young people in remote areas, on what matters and what can be done actually to improve their livelihoods and improve their lives in general. So thank you, Sandra. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Zitouni, for really profound words on long term. I believe that Mr. Barreto of CEPRO in Brazil is back online, and I would like to just address the question that you couldn't answer on decentralization and regionalization.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that.
No worries. What is the role of technology in decentralization and regionalization. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for the failure. When we talk about the hyper globalization, it is a concept that relies between mass policies and sovereign concepts. So it tries to avoid the transaction costs and the borders, and it can help to develop some certain economies. Now, this concept is being reevaluated in some societies because not much people could afford for the richness that was created in the globalizations or in the hyper-globalization period. Notwithstanding, technology in a first view is a drive to the globalization. It can uniformize languages, users' experiences. It is dominated by big corps that dictate certain platforms, user experiences, etc., etc. So I believe that technology, if driven not only by government, but by the market agents, and for the new companies that are rising right now, to attend its local necessities, it can play an important role to decentralize and regionalize the way people have access to goods and services, as to public services also. And for instance, it would help to reduce local economic costs that could be very important to decentralize and regionalize the access to richness that is created by the markets.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Barreto. A huge thank you to all our speakers, to the audience, to the G-STIC team behind the scenes facilitating the session. We have the science, we have the tools, and we have the knowledge. 2022 brings the beginning of the end through our collective effort to end pandemic, to end climate change, and to end global inequalities. Thank you all for listening. The session is now closed.